right, so we are now going to be reading about the Sugar Act. And the Sugar Act is an indirect tax. We're going to tax the merchants so that way they will pay the increased taxes. Now, by taxing the merchants, everyone else will have to pay increased prices because they're going to raise prices. It was a sneaky way of taxing everybody while only really taxing one group. And it was passed into law April 5th, 1764. So the Sugar Act, which is also known as the Plantation Act or the Revenue Act, depending on where you were at. If you were in the 13 colonies, you're probably calling it the Sugar Act, because in New England, you had to face a bunch of new taxes, but you were going to face a reduced amount of taxes on sugar. We're trying to entice you into liking this one. But in the West Indies, where they grew sugar on plantations, they called it the Plantation Act because it was taxing the sugar produced via molasses and sugarcane, which was grown on these plantations. So since it had to do with plantations, they called it the Plantation Act. And if you were in London, England, where they wrote this act, they called it the Revenue Act because the point of this act was to raise money to pay for soldiers, 10,000 soldiers that were going to be staying in the colonies, and to pay debts accumulated by Great Britain fighting in the French and Indian War, which happened in the 13 colonies. So they're raising money as revenue. It was British legislation, so a British law, aimed at ending the smuggling trade in sugar and molasses from the French and Dutch West Indies, and the biggest part of it, providing increased revenues to fund enlarged British Empire responsibilities following the French and Indian War. Why would they have enlarged responsibilities? Well, because of the Treaty of Paris, we know that Great Britain engaged in a large amount of new land, and there was a large barrier that was in place, the Appalachian Mountains, that they were going to guard, saying that these people can't go past it because of the Proclamation Act of 1763. Don't go past these mountains. Well, you need people to actually enforce that. You need people to actually fight the Native Americans, and that's going to happen in this new land without these soldiers to guard in this new territory. People were going to continue things like Pontiac's War that we talked about. There are still threats out there, and they need a military presence to guard them. So it's all going back to the 7 Years' War. It's all going back to the French and Indian War. We got to pay for it, and we have to continue paying for it. So the Sugar Act was actually a reinvigoration, a rebirth, a continuation of an old law. It was the Molasses Act of 1733, which lasted for 30 years, but then it expired. And while it did make money, it was relatively ineffective because of all the smuggling. The French and Dutch were sneaking in molasses and sugar from the plantations in the West Indies for way cheaper than the British farmers on the plantations with slavery were producing and able to afford. And there were a lot of people in the colonies, British citizens at the time, who were participating in this smuggling. So the Sugar Act provided for strong custom enforcement. So people who actually make you pay the taxes whenever you bring things in, on the duties, taxes on refined sugar and molasses imported into the colonies from non-British Caribbean West Indies sources, French and Dutch. So protests had been received from America against the enforcement of the Molasses Act. So people had previously not liked the Molasses Act, together with a plea that duties, the tax, be set at 1 penny per gallon. So for every gallon of molasses, that's where they're getting their sugar from. You get the molasses from sugar cane, and they're turning that into sugar. Say for every gallon of molasses, 1 penny goes to the government. We can handle that. We can pay that. No more. If it's more than a penny, we can't pay that tax. And so although warnings were issued to the government that traffic could bear no more than that 1 penny, the government, under the leadership of Prime Minister George Grenville, Prime Minister is sort of like the British president, less than the king or queen, but a lot more day-to-day power. He refused to listen and said, I know you can only handle 1 penny, but 3 pennies on foreign molasses in the Act, which in the preamble, it straight up says the whole point of this is that all sugar and molasses imported into the colonies is to be taxed in the name of Great Britain to help offset Britain's debt accumulated during the French and Indian War. The Act thus granted a virtual monopoly of the American market to British West Indies sugarcane planters. The colonists deeply resented being underhandedly forced to buy from a specific seller rather than be allowed the choice. Colonial protests did eventually die out when these duties and the taxes were lowered, when they were reduced 2 years later. The protected price of British sugar actually benefited New England distillers, actually made it cheaper for them to be able to produce rum. That's why they wanted the sugar. So you'd have sugar cane grown in the West Indies, or the Caribbean as we now call it. The sugar would be grown in sugar canes, and it would be crushed down into molasses, and they would take the molasses and ship it up to the distillers in New England, and they would turn it into sugar, and they would use it to create rum. You ever heard of pirates drinking rum? Arr! Well, that rum came from New England. Though they did not appreciate it because there was this little clause in there talking about how overall you're going to end up taxing more. Even though they got a reduced tax on sugar in New England, all the other portions of it, it's going to get taxed in the West Indies. It's going to get taxed in whenever it gets shipped off as rum. All these different parts of it are going to get taxed, but the one part that was reduced was sugar, hence Sugar Act. But overall, because of all the different taxes, the overall price was going to go up. More objectionable to the colonists was stricter bonding regulations for shipmasters, whose cargoes were subject to seizure and confiscation by British customs commissioners, and who were placed under the authority of the Vice Admiralty Court in distant Nova Scotia if they violated the trade rules or failed to pay duties. Let's translate that, shall we? Basically, if you get caught smuggling, especially molasses and sugar, if you get caught smuggling this stuff, huge fine. Got to pay lots of money. Also, there's only one court that's going to hear your case, and that court is way up north in what is today Canada. By the way, you have to walk there. When you get there, no jury. The judge just gets to say, I don't like you, or I do like you. No jury. You're going to be judged without a jury. And oh, by the way, you know that ship that you had all your stuff on? Yeah, the government just took it. It's theirs now. So people were angry a lot about that stuff. And as a result of the Sugar Act, the earlier clandestine, the earlier more normal chill out trade in foreign sugar, and thus much colonial maritime commerce, was severely hampered. Blah, blah, blah. People were making less money. So people are going to have to face harsher penalties, and they're making less money. People are angry about it. Great Britain wanted to raise money to pay for the military they were leaving behind after the 7 Years' War, after the French and Indian War. They wanted to pay for the actual war itself. And so they came up with what they thought was this clever idea of making money without actually taxing directly the people in New England. But people were making less money, and they were facing harsher penalties. So it made them pretty angry.